everybody. Hi, SEO folks. I'm Francois. I'll be your host for today. Thanks for joining us and welcome to OnCrawl's SEO in Orbit webinar series, the first ever series sending SEO into space. SEO in Orbit is a series of webinars running through June 24th, taking you on a trip through the galaxy of technical SEO. So watch the webinars. After each webinar, join us on Twitter to vote for the top tip you get by our incredible guests, and we'll send all of the top tips and the best retweets with technical SEO advice into space for real on June 27th. We'll keep you posted on that. So feel free to participate on Twitter using the hashtag OnCrawlInOrbit, or head to oncrawl.com/SEO in Orbit for more information. And today's SEO in Orbit is JavaScript in 2019. Modern SEO for modern users. So I'm Francois Goub, and I'll be your host for this episode. I'm the founder of technical SEO data platform OnCrawl, and I'm the typical SEO geek. So I'm very, very pleased to welcome as a guest for today. Welcome, Mike. Hello, Mike. How are you?
Hey, Francois. I'm good. How are you doing? Thanks for having me.
I'm good. I'm good. Thanks for accepting this invitation.
Yeah, of course. I'm very excited to be here. I always love to nerd out on this type of stuff.
So our guest today, Mike King, is an artist and technologist, all rolled into one. He recently founded boutique digital marketing agency HyperRank. Mike consults with companies all over the world, including brands ranging from SAP, American Express, HSBC, you name it, to a laundry list of promising startup and small businesses. Do you want to add a word, Mike, on your presentation?
Nah, I think you said it all. I mean, the only thing missing is that I'm very much a big SEO nerd.
So, Mike, I hear you also have a role in the hip hop and the indie rap game, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I used to rhyme for a living, and then, recently we purchased a company called UndergroundHipHop.com, which is an online record store.
Okay, really nice. So we're gonna start with a few definitions, and we're gonna start this webinar. So Mike, can you tell us? So we're gonna talk about JavaScript and SEO. So can you define what is JavaScript regarding JavaScript, building a website with JavaScript? Can you tell us what are what is the big picture about JavaScript right now, so that people that are listening are understanding what we're talking about?
I think there's a bit of a lag here, but we're gonna roll with it. So, excuse me. The big picture with JavaScript is that most interactive functionality is being powered by that at this point. There's more native functionality and things like CSS these days that make it so you don't necessarily need JavaScript for every single thing, but more often than not, the interactions that are happening on a web page are powered by JavaScript. So, there was largely the thinking back in the day for SEO. It's like, if you're using JavaScript, you just need to have a completely different version of the page that doesn't have interactivity and things of that nature. But that's just not realistic at this point. Most of the web is interactive in that way, and so search engines have had to keep up with what's going on with the web, and as such, SEOs have also had to modernize their approach to how we optimize with respect to JavaScript-driven pages.
Okay, and can you define a rendering as well?
Sure. So rendering has to do with, how is the page seen by different user agents. So specifically, we've always thought of the way that search engine crawlers have seen pages has been, just like the HTML version of the page. So none of the operations that JavaScript does are historically seen by search engines. Whereas when you have a fully rendered version of the page, it's the same way that the user sees it in the browser. And so search engines have come a long way in that they're able to crawl in a headless format, so that they can see what the user is seeing in the browser, but at the same time, they don't always do it. The rendering process is a separate process from crawling, and they may render or they may not, and they may do it at a later date or time than when they initially crawl.
Okay, thanks for that, Mike. You know, JavaScript has been a very hot topic in the SEO industry, and we see more and more developers that are learning like JavaScript frameworks like Angular.js, React, stuff like that. So they have been pushing very hard on building websites with JavaScript. So before we are talking about the SEO issues, in your point of view, what are some of the advantages that you believe using JavaScript gives a website in 2019?
Yeah, I mean, again, it just goes back to the interactivity. It goes back to making those views a lot faster, so you don't have to load an entire page in order to get the new information on it. So you can essentially you're using Ajax to repopulate sections of the page. So just loading those smaller sections using JSON objects makes it just a lot quicker than having to download every resource. It just makes the web better because you have more capabilities. The only reason we're able to have real applications like OnCrawl or any of the other tools that we're using in the space, or just even Gmail, is largely because of JavaScript. So it's just the reality that it's only going to get used more.
Okay, thanks a lot. And do you think that in terms of user experience, we are making things better with JavaScript, or are there some mistakes that can be made in terms of, SEO is taking into account more and more usage metrics. So do you think that JavaScript will improve that kind of metrics, or?
Yeah, I mean, it can go either way. It all depends on how good the developers and UX people are that are working on a given site. There are plenty of people that they'll like go and use a framework, and then they're like, what they're building could have just been flat HTML, or there's instances where people are using jQuery just to update like one object, and you don't need all that whole library to be downloaded and used to do something super simple. So it really just comes down to the same issues we've always been dealing with in SEO. Like, are people using the right things and then using the right things in the right ways so that they're creating optimal experiences? And then the other thing with JavaScript is that while it can make things faster in your experience, it can also make things much slower to load. So if you were to pop open developer tools and look at the timeline as things load, every single page you see will have a bunch of yellow on that chart because it's all the JavaScript. So yeah, it's just a reality that some people will use things the wrong way and make things suboptimal.
Yeah, and JavaScript used to be a major issue in SEO because at first search engines couldn't crawl it. That has mostly changed.
Yeah.
So in your point of view, how major search engines like Google are handling JavaScript today, and how they may evolve on that kind of things in the near future?
Yeah, I think the biggest issue there is computational expense. I mean, from OnCrawl, like having a JavaScript renderer makes your
Yeah.
costs way higher, right? Like, because a page that would take, like 3 milliseconds to download as just HTML may take 30 seconds to load with a headless browser. So the reality is, like, as the computational resources get faster, cheaper, and so on, I think Google's going to have less of a problem with it. It's going to be less about the WRS crawl rendering later. They may actually do it in parallel with the crawl itself. So I expect that over time they're just going to get better at it. But right now it's still kind of an option or secondary step for them.
Yeah, can you repeat the last sentence? Because I believe the connection lagged a little bit for our listeners.
Sure. Sure. I was saying that, as computational resources get cheaper, I think it's going to become the crawling and rendering being closer to being in parallel rather than being a secondary step. Because, right now it just takes them so long, and they need to basically determine whether or not it's worth them actually rendering a whole page. Because in some cases they may do it, and there's no differences or no material differences to the content. So I think they have to be very precise and use those resources effectively to make sure they're getting, or whenever they do it, it makes sense for them to do it.
Yeah, thanks, and I totally agree with you. It costs. It's very expensive to handle JavaScript calling. Regarding infrastructure cost, it's like 10 times for a
Hmm.
standard URL. It's like 10 times that amount when you want to handle JavaScript. So
Absolutely.
I believe SEOs should keep that in mind. That even if Google seems to have infinite money, they are really looking at their expenses. So whenever you're trying to improve something and to add something on your website, think about how you can help them save their resources, and which might be a good idea for your SEO.
Absolutely.
So, what are some of the technical issues today between JavaScript and SEO? What are the main things you're seeing when you're advising customers? Can you follow up on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the main thing is the disparity between the non-rendered version and the rendered version. So, you'll have instances where blocks of content are not being shown in the non-rendered version. So, or let's just call it the HTML versus the computed DOM version. So, you may have people that are loading resources after the page load, so after that document ready state, and search engines may or may not see that. Or there may be issues where there has to be some sort of user action in order for that content to be loaded. So those are the primary two things that I see. But also I see issues when people go to implement some sort of server-side rendering architecture. Oftentimes, depending on what the solution is, they may have that solution when the cache refreshes. It may take a long time, and so let's say Google or some crawler comes to that page and you're in the middle of that cache refresh. Well, Google may see that URL as a 500 error, and then that URL may fall out of the index. So that's the primary thing that I see when people try to do this. And I always tell people, despite the fact that Google keeps saying like, hey, do dynamic serving, progressive enhancement is actually still the better way to do it, so that no matter what user agent comes to the page, they can still see the bulk of your content. Huh, I can't hear what you're saying. I don't know what happened.
Um,
There we
can
go.
you hear me? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Are they viable solutions to make JavaScript and SEO work together, or are there mostly just workarounds?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much every either has an appliance you can add onto it for server-side rendering, or it can be native. So for instance, with React, you've got render to HTML string. I think that's the name of the function. But a lot of them at this point have that capability. And if not, you can use something like RenderTron, or you can use something like prerender IO or something like that. So then you're effectively creating these HTML snapshots. And that's what I was saying. That's where people can run into those issues where if their implementation of that, when it's refreshing the cache, it takes too long, then you run into that issue where search engines may see it as a page that's not there or an error.
And do you recommend to have to rely on a third-party API to render your JavaScript, or do you recommend to have a server-side rendering?
Yeah, we definitely recommend the server-side rendering because, if you're introducing another server, that can create more latency, and obviously we want the site to be as fast as possible, and also then that just creates another point of failure in your process too. So I would prefer that you or people that are working on websites, developers, DevOps people are thinking about this from how do we solve this internally and how we're building the site.
And there are tons of JavaScript frameworks, and I believe one is born every day. So, we talked about React, Vue, or Ember.js. What, in your opinion, should inform a developer's choice of a JavaScript framework?
Yeah, I mean, I think first and foremost, you just got to think about what are you trying to solve with this framework, because each framework has different strengths and weaknesses, and then also, are you just using a new framework just because it's a new framework? Things like Angular and React, they're pretty entrenched at this point. There's lots of code out there that you can leverage. There are people that know how to pick it up and help you with it and things like that. So you want to make sure that you're using something that's going to be around in 5 years. And realistically, React is the one that's winning. So I would recommend going with React. But nevertheless, any of these frameworks, again, you can create snapshots with a variety of different tools. So I don't think it matters as much which one you choose, but I would still recommend go with the tried and true one, or the one that meets your technical requirements, rather than just using the new shiny toy just because it's new.
Yeah, and are there some characteristics to avoid absolutely regarding the choice of the framework? You just said that there might be some differences between your content when you are using JavaScript rendering. So, are there some constraints, particular constraints you want to avoid when you choose a framework?
Yeah, I mean, again, from my perspective, I prefer a framework that natively can allow you to server-side render. So beyond that, that's all I really care about. Um, all the frameworks have the capability, for as far as I understand, to account for the basics of that. So anything you're doing on top of that is up to you and your needs. As far as is one faster than the other, I think it all comes down to the configuration. But beyond that, I don't think that any of them, at least any of the known ones, like the more popular ones, has a native problem that you might want to avoid it entirely. But I will say, at least up until the latest versions of Angular, Angular was not as good as React for a lot of reasons. And it's so wild because Angular comes out of Google. So why didn't it natively have server-side rendering until they introduced Angular Universal with Angular 4? It's a bit ridiculous that we're in that place, but I think right now it doesn't matter as much.
And there's another question coming to my mind. We saw, for instance, Bing saying that in the near future we could push the content through their API. Do you see that kind of move, a way to see the workaround for guys like Bing to handle JavaScript, because we are pushing them the content so they don't have to render the page? So do you think that search engines will evolve in that kind of way?
Yeah, I actually think that makes a lot more sense. But in a way, we're kind of going backwards with that, in that because back in the day, we used to always push out to them and say, hey, come get this URL, but right. So I think that's actually better, and it also speaks to an architecture for web applications that makes a lot more sense, where everything is far more portable, right? So you're thinking about your mobile app, you're thinking about a variety of other applications of your data. It makes sense for everything to come from a central source and be built in like a microservices architecture where you're able to push everything out from a single API. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think that if the web goes that way, it allows everything to just be portable and all the new environments and modes of consuming content. So yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And it cuts down the computational expense from crawling on Google's side, and it allows them to get things a lot faster.
Thanks. Next question, Mike. Is the knowledge of how JS affects SEO something you expect web developers to know?
Yeah, and I think more and more you're seeing them know that. So to that point, that's what I'm saying. There's so many appliances, so many plugins and things that allow for server-side rendering. You know, for a long time, search engines or developers just believe, yeah, Google will figure it out. It's fine. My code is fine. What are you talking about? But I think, you know, uh, the client-side rendering being such a problem for so long, and so many people like me telling developers like, no, this is a problem, you need to solve this, that they've actually moved in that direction. So there's libraries like Next.js that allow for server-side rendering and things like that, and that comes out of that community. It's not necessarily like an SEO that sat down and made that. So I think that developers are just way more cognizant of that problem, and they're actively looking to solve it.
Yeah, thanks. And in your regarding all the experiences you have with many different customers and many different constraints, because you have customers in Europe, in the US as well. What is your advice when it comes to evangelizing developers about technical SEO? Is there a particular method that you see working, or what's your thought about that?
No, but I think that I should come up with like the Mike King method for technical SEO. No, seriously, I think it really just comes down to, you know, just general, like how do you engage a person and get them to do something for you? You appeal to their self-interest. So any developers that we work with, we figure out like what are they measured on, what do they care about, and then there's also, you know, the marketing teams or the product teams or what have you, and align directly with those things, and then we'll say like, here's how this impacts your ability to meet your own goals. So I don't think it's anything, you know, crazy. Like, you know, everyone always says like, hey, take the developers out for a beer. Sure, that works if you are in-house, but if you're in a situation like us, you know, we have to show what the value is going to be to your career or to your short-term OKRs and what have you, so that implementing this stuff is valuable to you as it is to us.
And you know, I saw one of your conferences, Mike, a few months ago, where you talked about technical SEO renaissance, right? And do you think that today a good SEO is at first a developer, or can a marketer can evolve into an SEO with some technical skills?
So yes and no. Like I don't think you necessarily have to be a developer, but you have to be able to understand and communicate with developers. So I think that, you know, being curious about that stuff, learning enough that when you see code, you know what the problem is. You don't necessarily have to write the code, but you can, like, if you have enough of an understanding that you can compare the view source version of a page to the computed DOM version of the page and know precisely where the issues are happening, that's all I need from you. Like, I don't need you to be able to write React or Angular or anything like that. But I do, if you're asking me to choose like someone to turn into a great SEO, I think that if I had to choose between like a marketer and a developer, I would probably go with a developer. Just the way that they think, the way that they deconstruct problems, the way that they communicate with great attention to detail, because development is just so tedious. You have to have that level of attention to detail. So yeah, I would prefer, if I had to choose between the two, a developer over a marketer. But nevertheless, you know, we've been pretty good at training either to make it work.
Okay, thanks. So we last question about JavaScript and SEO. If you had to choose just one thing when you're trying to optimize a website with JavaScript, would you focus first on the content, making sure that this is the same content displayed, or will you focus first on the payload?
I would focus on the content. rather than the payload. So, what's most important to everyone is just being able to understand and see the content. I think the payload is what you want to focus on, like once you know that the content is accessible. So, yeah, that's where I would focus. But definitely shortly thereafter, like let's get the payload down pretty dramatically too.
Okay, thanks for that, Mike. Now a few quick questions.
Okay.
Do you have a favorite technical trick?
Yeah, we still do that pre-render trick that the rel pre-render trick that I talked about a few years back. And so basically the way it works is, you use the GA API to see what is the most likely next page that the user would go to based on the page they landed on, and then do rel pre-render with that. Google X or Chrome rel pre-render works recently, and that it's called no state prefetch now, where basically they don't execute all the JavaScript when it's pre-rendering in the invisible tab. So I was concerned that that was going to stop working because they had this spec in the works for a while, but nevertheless it speeds up the entire. Did you get that?
No, no, sorry, the connection lagged a little bit. Can you repeat the last
Okay.
sentence?
Yeah, I was just saying that no fetch, or excuse me, the rel pre-render trick, it still works very well. It allows the user to have a faster experience through each subsequent page because the pages are loaded in an invisible tab in the background, and then by the time they click on the link, it just appears instantly. It's a little slower now that Google made that change in Chrome, but it still works and it speeds up the experience.
Okay, thanks. And next quick question. Do you have a least favorite technical SEO question?
Uh, I don't know if it's. I think I have a least favorite SEO question, not a technical SEO question. I think when people ask me technical questions, it's because they don't understand anything. So I'm patient there. But I hate when people ask me like, how long should their content be? Because that's exactly the wrong question. And I guess it is kind of a technical question as well because we've been moving more into what I've been calling technical content optimization, like all the stuff around natural language processing and text mining and such. So yeah, it is technically a technical question that I hate.
Okay. And do you have, this is a question we are asking all our guests. Do you have a favorite Google bot?
Yeah, the ones that actually work. No, so what I've found lately is that there's a lot of Googlebot user agents that people aren't mindful of, and so they'll be like, "Why can't I use the PageSpeed Insights tool?" It's like, yeah, because your CDN is blocking all the Googlebots that aren't just standard Googlebot. So I might actually just write a blog post about all the other Googlebots so that people are mindful of that, because they'll be like, "Why can't I use the structured data testing tool? It's saying my page doesn't exist," and it's like, because you're blocking it. So I don't have a favorite one, but there's just way more than we talk about.
Uh, Last question. Do you have a favorite planet? Because we are trying to send SEO into space. So, what's your
Yeah,
favorite planet?
my favorite planet is Pluto because they stopped allowing it to be a planet, and I don't think that's fair. Bring back Pluto.
Thanks a lot, Mike. Thanks a lot. From Pitchbox app on Twitter, there are a few questions,
Okay.
and feel free to our listeners. Feel free to ask your question to Mike. So first question is, what are your top 3 tips to make any website super fast?
Super fast. Well, I think most of those things, like the super fast things, more come from the server side. Making sure you're on a CTN using H2. Making sure that your database is optimized. I think that's something that people don't think about enough, at least from the SEO side. There's just a lot of gains to be had by, excuse me, consolidating queries and making there less queries and things like that. So those would be the 3 major ones. But if we're talking about front end side, I would say look at code coverage. I would look at things like the resource hints, so like DNS prefetch, rel prerender, things like that. And also preload, I think, is really valuable. So what rel preload will do, let's say you've got like an image buried in your JavaScript that doesn't get executed till way later in the rendering of the page, you can preload that earlier. So by the time that Google or the browser gets to it, it will have already loaded it. So I'd say those are probably the three that I would look at most.
Okay, thanks. A question from Nikki Mosier. What's your recommendation on how to solve the trading slash and non-trading slash issue that happens in React but isn't good for SEO?
Yeah, I think the best way to go there would be just to do a rel canonical, because the way that URLs are routed in React, it's a little more difficult for you to set up the 301 from one to the other. So it's easier to just do the rel canonical.
Okay, thanks. And a nice question from Omi Sido. Hi, Omi. He said, Mike, do you know whether Google uses pre or post DOM HTML for interpreting hreflang?
So they've said that they use the pre for that, and I believe who was it? I think Paul Shapiro was testing this recently, and I think he found that to be not true. I can't remember, but bottom line is, the way to be safe is to make it the pre, because you never know whether or not they're going to actually render the page. So I would recommend doing it the HTML version. And also I would say you might want to consider even doing it in the header so that you know that they're always going to see it no matter what.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Mike. And when it comes to canonicals or rel alternates, they are just directive. They are not rules.
Mm-hmm.
So Google is not always supposed to follow them. So when you put it in the headers, it will be working for sure.
Absolutely. And I think, and I could be completely wrong with this, but I think the reasoning for that is that it's so much more difficult to put something in an HTTP header. Like, you probably know what you're doing if you put it in the header rather than if you put it in the code. So my guess is that they probably think of that as a stronger signal than just putting it on the page.
Okay, thanks a lot. I think we are running out of time, so I won't take any more question. A big thank you, Mike, for joining us. It was a real pleasure to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
And sorry for the short lagging and the technical issues we had. Thanks again, Mike. Feel free to follow up the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag OnCrawl and vote for the best tip from this webinar that we will send into space. And so don't forget to vote for it. And so thanks for traveling with us today through this corner of the technical SEO space. And swing by OnCrawl.com for your free trial if you want to try a technical SEO platform. And feel free to join us for the next episode of SEO in Orbit on May the 7th with Jan Lurie for a result-focused approach to log file analysis, which might be very, very interesting.
Yeah, Ian is awesome. And like I said before, bring back Pluto. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks. Cheers, Mike. Have a nice day.
You too.
Bye.